Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing The Second Mountain by David Brooks. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of the book, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to. I'll probably end there. I'm not sure what I'll be reading for next time. David Brooks is a very famous writer in conservative circles. He's been a writer at the New York Times for quite a long time at this point. He also has been the co-host of a segment on PBS NewsHour for quite a while as well, I think over 20 years. He had co-hosted it for a long time with Mark Shields, who recently stepped down and he's to the right of Jonathan Capehart, who's a Washington Post columnist who's there now. Was Shields and Brooks, now it's Capehart and Brooks, or Brooks and Capehart. And so that's what he's best known for. He's written several books, probably still best famous for Bobos in Paradise. He wrote The Social Animal, which is another book of his that I've read. He's written a couple of other books, but he's a relatively famous author, especially with a certain subsection of people, which I'll talk about in the review. What this book is uh, David Brooks looking at the current system in society, especially American style capitalism, and believing it's too hyper individualistic. And this book is kind of a call for us to return to more of a, he doesn't use the word communitarian, he doesn't use the word beloved community, but something closer to, at its ultimate end is probably the beloved community, but probably something closer to just having more of a deeper bonds in one's own community, and committing one's life to less things that are hyper individualistic and more that are community based. That's ultimately what the book is about. Um, he has a manifesto. He calls it relationship manifesto at the end of the book, which is I think a really good summation of everything he's talking about previously. But the book covers a lot of ground. The title comes from this idea of the second mountain, which is when someone is driven to achieve something in their life at the beginning of their life up until maybe middle age or a little bit after middle age. It's very I focused, it's very individualistic. It's, do you want to get a certain amount of money in the bank? Do you want to get a certain job with a certain title? And Brooks says basically after you've achieved that, you realize how maybe unsatisfying that is, and then you look to a second larger mountain, which is the second mountain, which is more of an external focus on other people and how you can help the broader society. And he's basically talking about how his journey in his life has led him to that second mountain. He talks very briefly about his own marriage. He had a previous marriage. He's been married since remarried, so he talks a little bit about those two marriages. He talks about his religious journey, the difficulties in the religious journey, and ends by talking about a bunch of different people, a bunch of different stories of people who have lived this lifestyle of trying to go into the community and find ways to improve the community, be it bring in people who are maybe at-risk youth and help them do whatever they need to do, find a job, go to school, whatever it is, to actually forming organizations to help improve community access to education or safe spaces or whatever it may be. And so that's really ultimately the book, is him trying to make a pitch for this other way of being and moving away from the hyper individualistic to more of the community based lifestyle and his own journey to get there. David Brooks is a really authentic writer. This is one of those books I could probably talk about for a long, long time. I'll try to be brief with it, though. He's a very authentic writer. I think he writes with a certain amount of humility. He's relatively easy to read. Whenever I read him, I get a sense that he really, truly believes what he's writing about. He's not doing this because he's trying to impress anybody or get a book out. It really, to me, is something he's thought about. He quotes a lot of other writers in his work. And so he is kind of in a tradition of religious writers as well as other community-oriented people. Mother Teresa is quoted in this book, Dorothy Day, others as well. People who, there's the Holocaust comes up quite a bit in this book, and so I will say if that's something that maybe is something that you're sensitive to, I would be wary of. But just people who have been in situations that call for really the best and worst in humanity as far as trying to center oneself in terms of obligations to other people and how one views one's place in the universe, in a world of good and evil, and things like that. So it's a pretty powerful read. I think that the summation at the end, I think, is a really good summation of his argument. I think the section on religion, I think, was maybe the best part of the book, where he talks about his own religious journey. I think David Brooks has this thing that I don't usually like in other writers. Richard Reeves, I know every time I read one of his books, I feel like anytime he inserts his own opinions and self into the book, it kind of grinds the book to a halt. And Brooks is kind of the opposite. Whenever Brooks comes into the book, to me, it kind of brings the story alive because it's something clearly he's been wrestling with personally. And I feel when he enters the book, I kind of feel that struggle. And because he writes with the humility of like saying, I don't know, you come away with him on that struggle and the understanding of these are things that people wrestle with, and just to understand this is not something that's easily digested. There may not be a right answer. And so when he talks about his relationship to both Judaism and Christianity and that kind of path on both that religious journey of his and how he's interacted with people of both communities, I felt that was really touching and powerful, and I really did appreciate that quite a bit. Um, the things I would say, and the book is relatively quick. It's 300 pages, but it reads pretty quickly. Um, I think uh, the thing I would say as far as the stuff that I didn't like as much, um, ultimately, I think he makes something of a straw man argument out of the hyper individualistic, some would say egalitarian if maybe you were being a little bit more kind to the society. And I think this book pairs really well with Tyranny of Merit. If I can find it, I will link it in the show notes when I put this up. There's an interview that Brooks did with Fareed Zakaria at the Aspen Institute. I believe it was earlier this year, where you can see them going back and forth, and they are essentially arguing. Fareed Zakaria is saying to David, the beauty about, he's like, I'm a secular Muslim. I grew up in a country where my choices were very limited because of the religiosity of the community, and I'm really happy that I got away from that. Women, multiple times throughout history, have had their choices reduced simply because of their gender. And so Zakaria really does push more of the egalitarian argument as far as finding happiness in life. And I think Brooks kind of pushes back against him in that conversation in a really interesting way. Some of the arguments that he makes, in my opinion, he kind of fawns a little bit for an earlier time when the country was less hyper individualistic. He kind of points to, I don't know if he specifically points to the kind of pre-war America. I will say pre-war and really post-war as well. Um, Film noir comes out of the tradition of people feeling disillusioned in 1950s America and 1960s, 1970s America with the consumer lifestyle then. And so for me, there's a little bit of like, there are some things that I think are always going to be with us. One point he talks about status and how the hyper individualistic world leads to contest of status. I also think that would be no matter what system that you have, if you have a communitarian system, that will also is part of human nature. And his argument comes down to, in some ways, what we call human nature. We always say this is part of human nature, and it's competitiveness and striving and more male macho ways of thinking. And there's the other parts that are like caring and compassion, and we ignore those things. And I think that's a little bit of a straw man argument. I think if Zakaria had heard that, Zakaria may have said, we don't ignore them. We just say different people are going to move in different directions and have the fullness of life to choose which of these paths they go down. And he doesn't really struggle with that idea of, well, if this is the way that people want to live, why are they not choosing to live this way? And he doesn't really ever struggle with personal agency in any of this. And I'm reminded a little bit of Phil Donahue passed away last week, and he had a famous interview with Milton Friedman on his program in the 80s. And I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have it exactly in front of me. But it was something like, Donahue asked Phil Friedman, do you ever struggle with the idea of capitalism and the inequalities that it generates and the greed that it generates in people? And Friedman doesn't miss a beat, and he basically just says, is there ever been a society that has not run on greed? And so this kind of idea that you're going to magically get rid of some of these things that naturally may be more apparent in a hyper-individualistic system, there's no indication that they would completely go away. And the underlying current of all this, the bedrock principle, is that people want to be around other people all the time. And he doesn't really talk about the shunning or the difficulty that maybe introverted people or neuroatypical people or people with mental illness or depression would have in this system. So it's just kind of, in my opinion, kind of conveniently not discussed. All that being said, if you read The Tyranny of Merit and you said to yourself, this book very much argues from the brain perspective, I would like something that argues this from the heart perspective. The Second Mountain is a great, great book for that, because that's what this is. And that's why in some ways it's hard to criticize, because it's like, well, David really, really wants this thing to happen and to be true, Again, I would argue, if you look at the history of most communes, they don't end particularly well. He doesn't use the word beloved community, but he points to Josiah Royce, who coined the term beloved community. So um, this is more just like starting the conversation of what this could look like. And I think I teased it at the beginning. David Brooks is kind of known for having the audience of people who buy books in airports. That's essentially his audience. These are people who tend to be white collar professionals, people who either have their bachelor's degrees from Ivy League schools or have master's degrees, who travel quite frequently for their job. So as consultants, as lawyers, as doctors, whatever it is. So we're talking about people who probably are in the top 10 to 15% economically. So if you're someone who reads this book and have absolutely no connection with it whatsoever, because this doesn't describe you or any of the people you know, I would completely understand that. In my mind, if I am saying, what do I think David Brooks would like to achieve with this book? I think if David could wave a magic wand, he would basically find everybody who is in their 40s or in their 50s who's a VP or director or on their way to being a VP or director, stop what they're doing as being VPs and directors and go back to whatever small town they came from. Most of them didn't come from small towns, but imagine they came from small towns or whatever community it is, and they would use their intelligence and their passion and their drive to make the lives of other people better. Do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't. I think another kind of assumption about this book is that people who are living this life of striving tend to be unhappy. That's also, compared to people, I'd point David to Unequal Childhoods, which kind of makes the reverse argument, is that people who find themselves in professions where they're striving, they're working a lot, they're making a lot of money. Some people are very, very dissatisfied with that life, but a lot of other people are actually quite happy and satisfied with it as long as they have some relationships in their life, be it spouses or children. So I'd be interested to see what people thought of this book. I overall liked it and would recommend it, but I also, if you're not interested in this topic, I completely understand. If you read The Tyranny of Merit and thought to yourself, I want to see the flip side of this, what it talks about, kind of the damage of the meritocracy and what an alternative could look like, this kind of points in that direction. It comes from a bottom-up, I would say, again, a very management consulting, white-collar professional way of looking at this, where there's this prodigal son that returns to the community and brings the community up with them. And there's also some issues with that as far as, like, if you're someone who's free of drug use and never grew up with people who use drugs, but in your community there are people who have used drugs, that may be very difficult for you to have any kind of authenticity to try to work with people to get them off drugs. And so there's a lot of, I think, perils, and there's the question of expertise. And, I thought it was a very interesting book, but I had maybe more questions than answers. And it also just, this argument, whenever I read it, it bounces off me pretty hard because I'm a pretty strong proponent of people being able to live and find their own version of happiness. And I'll put up and tolerate with a lot to walk that path. And so for me personally, it wasn't, it's not a book that's really based on statistics. It's really based on the feelings that Brooks is seeing and what he is seeing in society, without getting into the deep statistics of it. So just so you know what you're getting in for. If other people have read this and liked it, I would be interested. If people didn't like it, I would be interested too. If you've read really anything many of the things that I've reviewed in the past, Where Have All the Democrats Gone, A Tyranny of Merit, Ours Was the Shining Future. This is all Adrift. This is all kind of a part of the series of books, and this is Brooks's really response upstream of that, as far as going to the cultural root of what he sees as these problems and proposing changes to that. Again, he's not real boots on the ground. This is what we actually need to do. This is more of like a wouldn't it be nice type of thing. And then you get into how do you give other people obligations and that whole thing. And what if you think that someone would be happy, but they don't think they would be happy? How do you force them to do what you want them to do? Those are hard questions, and that's not that book for this. What is the tipping point where we would actually see this in transformation? How many of these people would you need? All that stuff. It's really just more of this is an idea of, like, wouldn't it be nice? So anybody who's read it, I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are. Until next time, thank you for watching the video. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. I'll leave links to those videos I mentioned below. I'm not sure what I'll be reading for next time. Until next time, bye.